and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 94, The Black Death and the Great Horde. Before we begin, my apologies for the late release of the January members episode. I didn't manage to complete the recording in time to release it before this episode, but you can expect it to come out sometime this week. When Ozbek Khan died, the Great Horde was at its zenith. Successive reforms had consolidated political and economic power. The economy was booming, and the official adoption of Islam was forging a new identity. The Khan's throne was a greater prize than ever. The right to claim the throne remained open to the whole of the ruling family, rather than a direct successor. When Ozbek died in 1341, his eldest son, Tinibeg, who sources suggest had been designated as an heir by his father, was away from the Horde's core territory on a campaign in the east. As we've seen before, this absence from the court created a space for other claimants to act. The records are clear that the senior Khatun, Taydullah, was the prime mover. Again, as we've seen before, the Khatuns controlled independent revenue and political clients, and even if they could never be Khans, they could be the power behind the throne, or at least the power behind an enthronement. Taydullah was in the capital and was able to take control of the treasury and seals, and start mobilizing support for her favoured heir, Jani Beg. As Tini Beg had control of a significant armed force, and had been designated as heir by Ozbek, he is treated in the records as having become Khan, but his succession was not recognized by a Kurultai. Jani Beg did not immediately position himself as Khan, but rather as a kind of regent responsible for administration of the court and capital, although this situation too was not formalized. Despite the informality, what it did do was block Tini Beg from returning to present his claim, since to do so would clearly require force and could escalate to open conflict. But Tini Beg could not stay in the east forever. Eventually he was forced to return. Almost as soon as he entered the central territories, he was killed by men acting for Jani Beg, allegedly incited by Taydullah. Sources are consistent that this was more of an assassination than a battle. Another brother, Hida Beg, was also eliminated, and with his pathway now open, Jani Beg called the Kurultai, where he was acclaimed as Khan. Although we cannot say that this was a violence-free succession, it was nothing approaching a civil war, like we've already seen and which we will soon be seeing on a larger scale. Our sources do not suggest that this was down to any particular preference for Jani Beg over Tini Beg. It comes down to his luck in being at the centre when Ozbek died, and Tini Beg being away. Together, he and Taydullah were able to ensure support by promising continuity, confirming elite rights to the distribution of wealth, which we've previously noted was key to ruling legitimacy in the Horde, and immediately seizing the treasury and seals. The prosperity and power of the Horde at this time created a widespread buy-in to the status quo, and there was a lack of disgruntled opposition looking for a better deal who could have been persuaded to support an alternative claimant. The strategic assassination of a few rivals, rather than large-scale bloodshed, was also acceptable within Chinggisid traditions and institutions, and probably also contributed to support for the new Khan, who had fully secured his position by 1342. The problems with the Italians arrived in 1343. Haji Umar, one of the Jochid begs responsible for tax collection from the foreign merchants, treated a Venetian nobleman named Andriolo Sivran in a way that the Italian found humiliating. Unable to let the Mongols off for not recognizing what he considered to be his superior status, Sivran and his men ambushed the tax collector and killed him, along with his family and staff. Khan could not overlook such a brazen assault on one of his officials. All the Italians, whether Venetian, Genoan, Pisan, or Florentine, were ordered to leave the Don and Black Sea trading posts. Their goods and ships were confiscated. The terrified merchants fled to the Genoese fortress at Caffa. The Venetian Senate passed a resolution condemning Sivran, exiling him from the city and banning him from trading in Tana. Then they sent emissaries to the Mongols. After being forced to wait at court for months, Janibek told them that he was willing to give the Italians a new contract if they would surrender Andriolo Sivran to a Jochid court. This would have been a sticky matter at the best of times, but with the Mongols now firmly Muslim, it was impossible for the Italians to hand over a Christian to their judgment and likely execution. So Genoa and Venice, usually fierce rivals, reached an agreement to work together to force the Mongols to let them back in, and sent the Khan word that they had imposed a trade embargo on Horde goods. I'm sure you will not be surprised to hear that Janibek was not impressed with this move. He put his own embargo on the Italians and prohibited grain exports to the west, which caused bread shortages from Constantinople to Italy, and he sent an army to take Caffa. The embargo even tipped Florence into famine in 1346, with the majority of the city's population forced to leave to forage in the countryside. This is the point at which the Khan appears to have banned trade with Christians, which, as we heard last time, may have included the Rus as well, and prevented the spread of the plague directly to the north. The siege of Caffa was unsuccessful because the Mongols did not have the naval power to prevent the Italians resupplying the fortress by sea. Janibek tried to equip a fleet of 30 ships, but on water his men were no match for the vastly more experienced Italian sailors, and all the ships were lost. Although both sides were most interested in finding a way to return to the status ante, the conflict would continue for several years, and Caffa would be besieged on several occasions. As we've already heard, the 1346 siege was abandoned due to the plague, which had already been having localized outbreaks around Crimea for a few years, reaching the Mongol camp. But that was not the end, and the Mongols returned to try again. The Khan's position was clear. The Italians were in his territory as guests and were required to follow his laws. But even as his embargoes began to bear fruit, the bread shortage affected Constantinople and the Italians much worse than their embargo did the Mongols. The Black Death began to take its toll on the Great Horde. The Mongols had always been familiar with the plague, even though their traditional lifestyle had kept them away from grain and its accompanying rats. They had hunted the steppe marmot for food and furs, and marmots were and are carriers of fleas infected with the plague. Other animals, hunted or used for hunting by the Mongols, wolves, foxes, polecats, snow leopards, hawks, and falcons, could also pick up fleas from marmots and bring them into contact with humans. However, the historical records are clear that this kind of transmission in the steppe, although it caused frequent localized outbreaks, did not result in the kind of epidemics that appeared when the plague carrier lived among humans and ate the same food. The Mongols had first encountered this kind of large-scale outbreak in the east, where major epidemics had devastated Yuan territory in China over the previous couple of decades. New countermeasures, such as quarantines and new shamanic rituals, had been introduced. Given the fairly short time frame and relations among the Mongol states at this time, there's no reason to be sure that Janibek had heard the details of these epidemics, and it's unlikely that the Jochids were prepared for how the plague would rage through the cities they had been building in the steppe. As mentioned in the last episode, this has been a neglected area of study, and, as I've also mentioned, due to the loss of the Horde's own records, we have to rely on outside evidence, comparisons and deductions from indirect evidence. We have far less detailed information on the Black Death in the Horde's territory than we do for Western Europe and the Middle East. However, scholars have recently been giving the subject more attention, including an interesting article published by Uli Shamil Oglu in 2017. Like in most of Western Europe, the decades leading up to the Black Death were a time of relative prosperity and abundance, with growing populations. Although the loss of records makes it hard to estimate the population ruled by the Horde, the surviving information from censuses conducted by the Mongols, archaeology, and other sources results in estimates of 8 to 10 million living within its territory and vassals, including the Rus kняжество. Muslim and Byzantine sources, as well as the Rus chronicles, all agree that there was a substantial loss of life in the steppe. Ibn al-Wadi reports 85,000 dead in Crimea, one of the Horde's main regions with a sedentary population. The Rus chronicles refer to villages and towns dead or abandoned. In Volga, Bulgaria, there's a spike in the number of gravestones with inscriptions in Bulgar. Elsewhere in the steppe, we also see a sudden expansion in Christian graveyards. Volga, Bulgaria, which was the largest and most populous sedentary region actually incorporated into the Horde, looks to have outright collapsed. Volga, the largest city in the north of the steppe and the key hub for the fur trade, as well as Bulgaria's grain production, experienced massive population losses and was abandoned. When the Khanate of Kazan emerges from Bulgaria in about 70 years, its centre has shifted further north to Kazan, and Bulgarian is no longer used on gravestones, or maybe even used as a written language at all. The last known use of written Bulgarian that we have dates to 1358. One possible explanation is that the literate artisans who would have lived in the cities died in such numbers that there was no one left to make stone grave markers. During the plague years, a parallel coinage appeared in the Horde. As well as the standard coins, which were minted in Sarai, a new mint appears to have been established in a place called Gulistan, most likely an attempt to create a backup mint in case production in Sarai became impossible. Last episode, we compared how different conditions in Western and Eastern Europe caused different outcomes resulting from the Black Death. The results in the Horde territory were different again, although much harder to reconstruct. Unlike Italy or England, we do not have the kind of evidence that would allow historians to reconstruct prices and understand the impact of the plague. Even for the grain trade, we have much more evidence from after 1350 than we do from before, which means we cannot adequately assess the price of grain. However, the amount of silver in Great Horde coins is reduced after the Black Death, which indicates that it was also experiencing inflation. In Western Europe, the losses from the plague led to the abandonment of villages more than towns or cities. In the steppe, we have different population characteristics. Bulgaria had a more widespread sedentary population, but its cities were hardest hit, and the evidence suggests that urban populations collapsed and did not recover for decades, and even then, in different locations. For Crimea, we do not have a clear enough picture to draw conclusions, although there are references to mass deaths in contemporary sources. The cities along the Volga that we've previously discussed were also agricultural centres where people would have eaten grain-based diets. Our descriptions of these places as growing and thriving population centres come mainly from Ibn Battuta, who visited in the decade before the plague. A couple of centuries later, Ottoman traveller Ivilia Çelebi visits and describes the region as inhabited by nomads and semi-nomads living in the ruins of cities that were destroyed in the time of Toktamish, the Khan in the generation after the Black Death, when smaller waves of plague were continuing to roll across the steppe. We can't really rely on this reporting as anything more than a reflection of when the people at the time Çelebi visited thought the cities fell into ruin, but it is almost certain that the sedentary populations along the Volga experienced the plague more severely than the nomadic populations in the wider steppe, who ate a mainly animal diet. At least we have evidence that the eastern region, the territory of the Blue Horde, which, as we've heard, maintained a more traditional steppe lifestyle, came out of the Black Death stronger than the western part. Historians argue over whether this was due to nomadic populations suffering less, or to the east recovering from the plague earlier than the west, or a combination of these factors. As we will see in upcoming episodes, the immediate post-plague period sees a dramatic expansion of Lithuania to the south into the western steppe, with major acquisitions of Ruthenian land for a time even reaching as far as the Black Sea coast. Some scholars link the rapidity of this expansion to the depopulation of these lands by the Black Death. The Khanate of Kazan is founded at the end of the 1430s, the Crimean Khanate in the 1440s, the Khanate of Kasimov in the 1450s, and the Siberian Khanate towards the end of the 15th century. Creating these states would have required sufficient population, so it appears that it took around a century to a century and a half for the populations of these regions to recover. In addition to the loss of written Bulgarian, it also appears that the literature of the Great Horde, written in Turkic by this point, also came to an end. As I've noted before, these works were lost, but we have descriptions of them from elsewhere. The last work to come out of the Great Horde that we know of is the Nek ul Firadis, or Clear Path to Heaven, which is attributed to a Mahmud Kurdari, born in Bulgar, later resident in Sarai. Works with similar titles, which promised salvation to the reader, appeared in various parts of the Muslim world during the Plague years, and seem to have been a reaction to the conditions of the time. Final manuscript of this book was copied in Sarai in 1358, and another text notes that the author died in 1360. Turkic literature from the wider region of the steppe reappears in the Chagatai Khanate only well into the 15th century. Further east, it also appears that the use of Syriac was abandoned for Turkic languages, and historians argue that there was a general cultural and technological regression across the region. One area of similarity with the Rus was that the Black Death increased the importance of religion. The leaders of the Sufi orders became closer allies of political leaders and reinforced their legitimacy and prestige, which in turn further drove the importance of the orders into the late 14th century. Shamiloglu argues that overall the Horde's experience of the Black Death is better compared to Egypt than to Europe. In Europe, the demographic changes caused extreme short-term hardship, but triggered long-term growth due to the social and economic changes that they caused. In Egypt, where the economy was controlled by absentee landlords living in the cities, the system was unable to adapt to the depopulation of agricultural areas, leading to precipitous decline. The Horde, where, as we've discussed, Mongol elites had been acquiring land holdings that they, still adhering to nomadic practices, did not live on themselves, may have gone through something similar. We began this episode looking at the Khan's succession, which, despite some court politicking and political assassinations, avoided mass conflict and showed the overall political and institutional stability that had been achieved in the Horde by the 14th century. This ends with the Black Death. Although the government comes through the main outbreak intact, centralized authority collapses in the middle of a new wave of Black Death in 1359 into what is usually referred to as anarchy, with dozens of would-be Khans fighting among themselves. While the surviving records, or lack thereof, make certainty impossible, there are strong arguments that the effects of the plague were the major drivers of this process. As we've heard repeatedly, the Horde was organized around networks of trade and communications rather than direct control of land. These networks appear to have broken down due to the depopulation caused by both high mortality and by people moving to get away from outbreaks. It also appears that the sub-Horde leaders were unable to meet for Kurultais and other discussions that were essential for the governance of the Horde and for maintaining relationships across the elites. Last episode we discussed how the Black Death triggered centralization in the Rus Kняжество and the emergence of a stronger state. There was no collapse in the northeast, but here we see the opposite effect. And it seems like the White Horde, the Ulus of Jochi itself, the ruling bloc of the Great Horde based in the hard-hit central Volga area, was the worst affected part, which exacerbated the political breakdown. The outcome was that as we move into the second half of the 14th century, we find an increasingly strong Moscow facing a much weaker and fragmenting Horde. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.